There is a sentence that makes many people uncomfortable when they first hear it. Bitcoin only has two paths to take. Either it goes to zero or it becomes unimaginably valuable. At first glance, it sounds like exaggeration, like something said by someone who is emotionally invested, someone who wants to believe. But the longer you sit with that idea, the more you realize it isn't dramatic at all. It is simply logical. Bitcoin does not fit into the world the way most technologies do. It wasn't created to make life a little easier, a little faster, or a little cheaper. It wasn't designed to integrate smoothly into existing systems or to politely ask for permission. Bitcoin was born as a response to a fracture, a loss of trust in money itself. And things that are born from fractures rarely end up becoming average. From the very beginning, Bitcoin presented itself as something binary. It either works or it doesn't. People either trust it or they don't. You can't half trust a monetary system. You can't kind of believe in a store of value. Money, at its core, is a collective agreement. And collective agreements don't live comfortably in the middle. They tip, they collapse, or they dominate. That's why the idea of Bitcoin settling into some modest, forgettable role never truly made sense. If Bitcoin were just another payment system, it would have already disappeared. If it were just a speculative asset with no deeper purpose, it would have collapsed under its own volatility long ago. If it were merely a technological curiosity, history would have moved on. And yet it didn't. Year after year, cycle after cycle, Bitcoin survived. Not smoothly, not quietly, but persistently. It survived regulatory pressure, internal civil wars, technological skepticism, media ridicule, bubbles, crashes, and the repeated declarations of its death. And this is where the story quietly changes. Because the longer Bitcoin stays alive, the less likely it is to end up meaningless. Most failed ideas die early. They don't get a decade to prove themselves. They don't attract millions of independent participants across the globe. They don't inspire entire industries, nor do they force governments and central banks to respond. Survival, in systems as adversarial as money, is not neutral. Survival is evidence. Bitcoin is not trying to win popularity contests. It does not try to look friendly or intuitive. It does not bend itself to human comfort. In fact, it often does the opposite. It demands responsibility. It removes safety nets. It places the burden of ownership and decision-making back onto the individual, and that alone filters out the majority of people. But the people who remain are not there by accident. What makes Bitcoin fundamentally different is that it doesn't promise improvement within the current system. It quietly questions whether the system itself is sound. It asks whether money should be infinitely expandable, whether trust should be delegated to centralized authorities, whether value should decay by design. These are not small questions. These are existential ones. And when you challenge something this fundamental, there are only two outcomes. Either the challenge is rejected completely, or it forces a transformation so large that the world before it feels outdated. There is no stable middle ground where Bitcoin exists, but doesn't matter. If Bitcoin continues to exist, it means that enough people across enough cultures have decided that a neutral, permissionless, mathematically constrained form of money is worth protecting. And once that threshold is crossed, value doesn't increase gradually. It compounds. Trust attracts trust. Capital attracts capital. And systems built on belief accelerate once belief reaches critical mass. This is why Bitcoin's upside, if it succeeds, looks absurd to those who analyze it with traditional models. Those models assume linear adoption, rational actors, and stable monetary frameworks. Bitcoin operates outside all three. Its growth is reflexive. Its adoption is emotional as much as it is logical. And the monetary framework it exists within is anything but stable. The world Bitcoin was born into no longer exists. Debt has grown, money creation has accelerated, confidence in institutions has weakened, and while these forces were once abstract, they are now being felt directly by individuals. People may not understand monetary policy, but they understand erosion. They understand when their effort buys them less than it used to. Bitcoin doesn't need to explain itself in this environment. It simply needs to remain standing. Every year that Bitcoin does not fail, the question subtly shifts. It stops being, what if this goes to zero, and becomes, what if this is actually working? And that question is far more dangerous to ignore. Because if Bitcoin is working, not perfectly, not universally, but sufficiently, then it isn't competing with other assets. It's competing with the very idea of how value is stored over time. And ideas like don't stay small. Bitcoin was never meant to be ordinary. It was never meant to be safe. It was never meant to make sense to everyone. It was meant to exist without permission and let the world decide whether that existence was necessary. And the fact that it's still here suggests that the decision is already underway. One of the biggest mistakes people make when thinking about Bitcoin is assuming that if it succeeds, it will do so in a polite and proportional way, that it will slowly grow, settle into a fair value, and then behave like a mature, predictable asset. That assumption feels comforting, but it misunderstands what Bitcoin actually is. Bitcoin has no natural resting point. Traditional assets tend to stabilize because they are anchored to cash flows, productivity, or institutional controls. Bitcoin is anchored to something far more unstable and far more powerful: collective belief about where value should live. And belief does not grow in straight lines. If Bitcoin were to fail, it would likely fail completely. Trust would evaporate, liquidity would vanish, and the network would hollow out. That path is easy to imagine, but the opposite path is harder for many people to fully accept. Because if Bitcoin doesn't fail, if it continues to function as designed, then there is no obvious reason for it to stop at levels that feel reasonable to us today. Bitcoin's value is not derived from what it produces. It is derived from what it protects against. It protects against monetary expansion that no individual can opt out of. It protects against arbitrary debasement. It protects against the silent tax of inflation that transfers value from savers to issuers. These are not marginal problems. These are structural features of modern money. And as long as those features exist, Bitcoin's role remains relevant. What's important to understand is that Bitcoin does not need everyone to agree with it. It doesn't even need most people to understand it. It only needs a growing minority to decide that holding value outside the traditional system is not optional, but necessary. And once that decision spreads beyond a niche, the dynamics change dramatically. Capital does not move based on philosophical debates. It moves based on incentives and fear. When people begin to feel that their savings are at risk, not because they made poor decisions, but because the rules themselves are shifting, they look for exits. Historically, those exits were land, gold, or foreign currencies. Bitcoin adds something new to that list: a digital asset that can be held, transferred, and verified without asking anyone's permission. If Bitcoin captures even a fraction of the value currently stored in traditional safe havens, its valuation stops looking extreme and starts looking conservative. This is where many models break down. They try to price Bitcoin as if it were competing with tech stocks or payment companies. In reality, Bitcoin is competing with centuries-old mechanisms for preserving wealth. And those pools of value are enormous. What makes this even more asymmetric is Bitcoin's fixed supply. As demand increases, supply does not respond. There is no ramping up production. There is no dilution. The price has only one direction to move in order to balance that equation. This is not a prediction. It is a mechanical outcome of the system's design. People often say, but surely at some point people will stop buying. The question is not whether buying stops. The question is whether selling overwhelms conviction. And that depends entirely on whether Bitcoin continues to do the one thing it promises to do: exist reliably. Every cycle Bitcoin survives, a new group of participants enters not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. Early adopters were driven by ideology. Later adopters were driven by speculation. The next wave is increasingly driven by preservation. That shift matters. When an asset becomes a place people flee to rather than gamble on, volatility eventually becomes a feature of transition, not a sign of weakness. Gold went through similar phases. So did sovereign currencies in their early years. Stability is not the starting point of monetary systems. It is the outcome, earned through survival. And Bitcoin is still in the survival phase. This is why dismissing Bitcoin's upside as unrealistic often reveals more about the framework being used than about Bitcoin itself. If you assume a stable world with disciplined monetary policy and long-term institutional trust, Bitcoin looks unnecessary. But that is not the world we are in. And Bitcoin does not require a collapse to justify its existence. It only requires doubt. Doubt is already here. When people begin to question whether the value they store today will retain its meaning tomorrow, they start reevaluating everything they were taught about money. Bitcoin doesn't need to convince them with marketing. It only needs to be an option, a quiet one, a stubborn one. And once enough people see it as a credible alternative, the repricing is not gradual. It is sudden. It is violent. It feels irrational to those watching from the outside. But from the inside, it feels overdue. If Bitcoin survives, it does not become just another asset. It becomes a reference point, a benchmark against which all other forms of value storage are measured. And assets that reach that status do not remain modestly priced. They absorb trust. They absorb capital. They absorb history. Bitcoin doesn't promise to go up forever, but it does promise that if it earns a permanent place in the global monetary landscape, its value will have to reflect that role. And that role, by its nature, is immense. There is no gentle version of that outcome. There has never been anything like Bitcoin before, and that statement has nothing to do with price charts or speculation. It has to do with scarcity, not perceived scarcity, not engineered scarcity, absolute scarcity, enforced not by authority but by code. For most of human history, scarcity has always been conditional. Gold was scarce until new deposits were discovered. Land was scarce until borders shifted or technology expanded what was usable. Even money, at different points in history, was scarce only until those in control decided it shouldn't be anymore. Scarcity has always been vulnerable to power. Bitcoin is the first asset where scarcity exists independently of human will. 21 million is not a guideline. It is not a policy. It is not a promise made by an institution hoping to maintain credibility. It is a constraint embedded so deeply into the system that changing it would require destroying the very thing that gives Bitcoin its value. That is a subtle but profound distinction. This changes the relationship people have with value. For the first time, individuals can opt into a system where they know, with mathematical certainty, that their share cannot be diluted. No emergency decision, no backroom meeting, no crisis justification. That certainty does something powerful to long-term behavior. It encourages patience, it rewards conviction, and it punishes short-term thinking. Critics often argue that scarcity alone does not create value, and they are right. Scarcity without demand is meaningless. But Bitcoin's demand does not come from fashion or novelty. It comes from function. It exists because there is a growing need for something that sits outside human discretion. In a digital world, this need becomes even more pronounced. As more of life moves online, the concept of ownership becomes fragile. Access replaces possession, licenses replace property, accounts replace assets. Everything becomes revocable. Bitcoin pushes in the opposite direction. It restores finality. If you hold it correctly, it cannot be taken, frozen, censored, or rewritten. That is not ideology. That is a technical property. Once people understand this distinction, something changes permanently. The first moment someone truly grasps that no one can create more of the asset they hold, a psychological line is crossed. And once enough people cross that line, the system reaches a point of no return. Not because Bitcoin becomes invincible, but because replacing it would require recreating the same level of trust without being able to start first. Any alternative that claims to be better than Bitcoin immediately faces a paradox. If it can be changed, it is less credible. If it cannot be changed, it offers no meaningful improvement. Bitcoin's imperfections are part of its defense. They make it predictable. They make it boring. And in money, boring is strength. This is where network effects quietly become overwhelming. Bitcoin does not grow because it is promoted. It grows because once it is adopted, it is very hard to abandon. The longer someone holds it, the more they understand its rules, its limitations, and its purpose. That understanding builds attachment, not in an emotional sense, but in a rational one. People do not leave systems that do exactly what they claim to do. At a certain scale, Bitcoin stops being evaluated as an experiment and starts being treated as infrastructure. And infrastructure does not need to be loved. It only needs to work. This is also why the idea of Bitcoin being easily replaced misses the point. You don't replace infrastructure because something newer exists. You replace it because it fails. And Bitcoin's core function, verifying ownership without trust, does not degrade over time. If anything, it becomes more valuable as trust elsewhere erodes. Every additional participant strengthens the system. Every year of uninterrupted operation increases confidence. Every failed attack reinforces the perception of resilience. These effects compound quietly in the background, while attention remains focused on price. But price is only the surface signal. Underneath it is a slow consolidation of belief. A belief not in future returns, but in finality, in rules that don't bend, in scarcity that doesn't negotiate. Once that belief becomes widespread enough, the valuation question changes entirely. It is no longer how much is Bitcoin worth, but how much value can realistically exist outside a system like this. And in a world where uncertainty is rising, the answer is far more than we are comfortable imagining today. Bitcoin does not need to capture everything. It doesn't need to replace currencies or overthrow governments. It only needs to exist as a credible, neutral alternative. And if it does, the amount of value it can absorb is not bounded by sentiment, but by necessity. Scarcity, once proven and trusted, is irreversible. And Bitcoin has been proving it, block by block, for over a decade. Bitcoin is often framed as a bet on collapse, as if its success requires everything else to fail. That framing is convenient, but it's wrong. Bitcoin does not need the world to burn to become valuable. It only needs the world to remain imperfect. And imperfection, as history suggests, is a much safer assumption. Modern financial systems are built on confidence, leverage, and coordination. When they work, they feel invisible. When they strain, the cracks appear slowly, then all at once. Bitcoin lives in the space created by those cracks, not as a replacement for daily life, but as an escape valve for long-term value. The defining feature of the modern era is not crisis, but accumulation. Accumulation of debt, of obligations, of promises that require future stability to remain credible. This does not mean collapse is imminent. It means fragility increases quietly, and fragility changes behavior. When systems become more complex, fewer people truly understand them. Trust shifts from comprehension to assumption. Bitcoin, by contrast, is brutally simple in its core guarantees. It does not promise prosperity. It does not promise fairness. It promises only that the rules will not change. In an increasingly unpredictable world, that promise alone carries weight. People often assume that states, institutions, and currencies are permanent because they have existed for decades. But permanence is not the same as durability. Durability is tested under pressure, and pressure, whether economic, political, or social, has been steadily rising across the globe. In such an environment, the demand for optionality grows, not revolution. Optionality, the ability to opt out, even partially, even quietly. Bitcoin offers that in a form that no physical asset can. It is portable across borders. It is verifiable without intermediaries. It does not require alignment with any ideology or nation. This is why Bitcoin adoption does not move uniformly. It accelerates in places where confidence is weakest first, where inflation is felt most directly, where access to stable financial infrastructure is not guaranteed. These are not edge cases. They represent the lived reality of billions of people. And once Bitcoin proves useful in extreme conditions, it earns credibility everywhere else. What follows is not mass adoption overnight, but gradual legitimization. Corporations begin to hold it, not out of enthusiasm, but out of prudence. Institutions explore it, not because they love it, but because ignoring it becomes professionally irresponsible. Governments tolerate it, then regulate it, not because they endorse it, but because banning it outright proves ineffective. Each of these steps reinforces the same conclusion. Bitcoin is not going away. At that point, the valuation conversation changes again. Bitcoin is no longer priced as a speculative curiosity. It is priced as a hedge against uncertainty itself. And uncertainty is not a temporary condition. It is a structural one. As the world becomes more interconnected, shocks propagate faster. Local problems become global ones. Centralized decisions have wider consequences. In such a system, assets that are globally neutral gain relevance. Bitcoin does not need coordination to function. It does not need alignment. It simply continues. This persistence is easy to underestimate because it lacks drama. There is no headquarters to attack, no leader to discredit, no balance sheet to expose. Bitcoin's resilience comes from its lack of narrative control. It does not try to reassure. It just exists. And existence under pressure becomes proof. Over time, the question stops being whether Bitcoin is risky. All assets are risky. The question becomes whether holding value entirely within systems that require constant intervention is riskier. That is not a question Bitcoin needs to answer. The world answers it slowly through behavior. People don't announce their loss of confidence. They act on it. They diversify. They hedge. They seek alternatives. Bitcoin benefits not from panic, but from quiet doubt, from the slow realization that stability is often borrowed from the future. In that sense, Bitcoin's rise is not a rebellion. It is an adjustment to a world where trust must be earned continuously, not assumed, where value needs an anchor that does not move with political cycles or economic expediency, where long-term thinking is not a luxury, but a necessity. Bitcoin does not promise safety. It offers exposure to a different kind of risk, one that is transparent, finite, and voluntary. And as long as the world continues to produce uncertainty faster than it produces trust, Bitcoin's relevance, and therefore its value, will continue to grow. Not explosively at first, but relentlessly. At some point, Bitcoin stopped feeling like a theory to me. Not because the price went up, and not because someone finally explained it in a convincing way. It changed quietly in the background as I watched the world behave exactly the way Bitcoin's design seemed to expect it to. Systems stretched, rules adjusted, promises were reinterpreted, and all of it was done with good intentions, under pressure, in the name of stability. That was the moment I understood something important. Bitcoin was never designed for a perfect world. It was designed for a very human one. I don't believe in Bitcoin because I think it's flawless. I believe in it because it doesn't pretend to be. It doesn't ask for trust in people, institutions, or future decisions. It asks for trust in constraints, in limits that cannot be negotiated away when things get uncomfortable. That distinction matters more to me than any projection or price target. When you really sit with Bitcoin long enough, you realize it doesn't try to convince you of anything. It doesn't care if you participate. It doesn't care if you misunderstand it or ignore it. It just keeps producing blocks every 10 minutes without commentary or justification. That indifference is unsettling at first, but over time, it becomes reassuring. Most systems constantly need to explain themselves. Bitcoin doesn't. I've noticed that the more responsibility a system demands from the individual, the less popular it becomes, but the more resilient it is. Bitcoin forces you to confront your own choices. There is no one to call if you make a mistake. No authority to appeal to. No narrative to hide behind. And that's uncomfortable in a world built on delegation. But that discomfort is also the source of its strength. Bitcoin doesn't reward blind optimism. It rewards patience. It doesn't protect you from volatility. It exposes you to it. And in doing so, it asks a quiet but serious question. Do you actually believe in what you're holding? Or are you just hoping someone else will pay more for it later? That question changed the way I think about value altogether. I don't know with certainty that Bitcoin will succeed. Anyone who says they do is lying to themselves. There is always a non-zero chance that it fails, that something breaks, that the world chooses a different path. I've made peace with that possibility. What I haven't been able to ignore is the asymmetry. If Bitcoin fails, life goes on. The system adapts, as it always has. But if Bitcoin succeeds, even partially, it reshapes the rules in a way that no incremental reform ever could. It introduces a form of value that exists outside persuasion and power. And once that exists, it cannot be unseen. For me, Bitcoin is no longer about gains. It's about alignment, about choosing to store a portion of my time and effort in something that doesn't rely on future promises, something that doesn't ask to be managed wisely, only left alone. That choice says something about how I see the future, not pessimistic, not utopian, just realistic. I don't expect the world to become fairer. I don't expect institutions to suddenly act against their incentives. I don't expect money to stop being used as a tool. Bitcoin doesn't fix those things. It sidesteps them. And that, to me, is its quiet brilliance. Bitcoin doesn't need everyone. It never did. It only needs enough people to decide that certainty is worth more than comfort, and that rules are more trustworthy than discretion. If that number keeps growing, Bitcoin doesn't just become valuable. It becomes inevitable. Not because it conquers the world, but because it fits it. And once you see it that way, it's hard to unsee.